Think about the life of a prince, someone who was born surrounded by riches, honor, and great expectations. Now imagine that. Suddenly, all of it disappears. This is the story of Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, who became lame. When he was only 5 years old, his world collapsed as he learned of the death of his father, his grandfather, King Saul, and his uncles. Amid the confusion and fear, he suffered a fall that left him permanently disabled. From that point on, the heir of a royal family was forgotten and taken to live in a distant and desolate land. Who was Mephibosheth? Why does his story, filled with tragedies, twists, and resilience, touch so many hearts? And how did someone who seemed forgotten and despised come to be honored at the table of King David? That is precisely what we will discuss in this video. Stay until the end to hear this moving story, filled with lessons that show the true value of a person is not in their condition, but in the grace and mercy of God. Mephibosheth was a man marked by tragedy from childhood. Lame after an accident, he lived for years in an isolated and forgotten place, often treated with disdain. But his story completely changed when, in a surprising turn of events, he was rescued from his condition and honored by sitting at the king's table in Israel. The story of Mephibosheth is often remembered as an example of overcoming adversity, of someone who rose from misery to be honored. But is that all? What if I told you there is a lesser-known side to the story that is rarely discussed? This lesser-discussed side reveals moments of betrayal, injustice, and even the loss of everything he had gained. The life of Mephibosheth teaches many lessons, but in a way different from what we usually imagine. It's not just about victories, but about being faithful and resilient, even in the midst of difficulties. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan and the grandson of King Saul. Yes, he was the son of David's great friend. But there's an important detail. In the same family, there was another man with the same name. That's why it's important not to confuse the two. This other Mephibosheth, the son of Saul and his concubine Rizpah, had a very different story. He and his brother Armoni were handed over by David to the Gibeonites to be killed as a way of making amends for a wrong committed by Saul in the past. It was in this context that the touching story of Rizpah, the mother of the two, occurred. For months, she stayed beside the bodies of her sons, protecting them from being devoured by animals, showing an unwavering mother's love. The Mephibosheth we are talking about here was spared from that tragedy because of the friendship and loyalty between David and Jonathan. Since there was another Mephibosheth in the same family and time period, it's important not to confuse their stories. The life of Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, was also marked by great tragedies and challenges. He was born as a prince of Israel, in a position of honor and privilege. But everything changed when he was only 5 years old. At that time, his grandfather, King Saul, his father Jonathan, and his uncles died in a battle against the Philistines, turning his life upside down. When Saul and Jonathan's deaths became known, Mephibosheth's nurse panicked. She knew that the royal family was in danger because, at that time, it was common for a new dynasty to eliminate all members of the previous family to prevent threats to the throne. Fearing for their lives, she tried to flee quickly with the boy in her arms. However, during the escape, Mephibosheth fell and became lame in both feet. After that, he was taken to a place called Lo-Debar, a simple and distant region located east of the Jordan River, in Gilead. In Lo-Debar, Mephibosheth was taken in by a generous man named Machir, the son of Amiel, who cared for him with kindness. Even living far from the luxury and glory his family once had, his life began to change when David, now the king of Israel, remembered the friendship he had with Jonathan. David never forgot the promise he made to Jonathan years earlier to care for and protect his descendants. Out of gratitude and respect for that friendship, David asked if there was still anyone from Saul's family to whom he could show kindness. as a way to honor the memory of his dear friend. This search brought Mephibosheth back into the story, initiating one of the most moving narratives in the Bible. At that time, it was common for kings to eliminate the descendants of previous dynasties to avoid potential threats to the throne. But David acted differently. Instead of seeking revenge, he wanted to show kindness and honor. It was then that Ziba, a former servant of Saul's family, informed David about Mephibosheth. He mentioned that Mephibosheth, who was lame, had been living for many years in Lodebar, a distant and forgotten land. Some scholars believe that when Ziba responded to King David, he revealed a certain prejudice. This is because Ziba made a point of noting that Mephibosheth was lame, perhaps insinuating that because of his condition, he had no value or usefulness according to the standards of the time. But David paid no attention to that. Without hesitation, he ordered that Mephibosheth be brought to him. David's attitude toward Mephibosheth is a clear example of God's grace. Just as David saw value in Mephibosheth, even when others despised him, God also looks at us with love, even when we feel incapable or unworthy. He does not care about our limitations, failures, or mistakes. On the contrary, he calls us close, restores us, and gives us a place of honor, just as David did with Mephibosheth. David received Mephibosheth with great honor and kindness. He restored the lands that had once belonged to Saul and allowed Mephibosheth to eat daily at the king's table, as if he were part of the royal family. Additionally, David ordered Ziba, a former servant of Saul's household, to care for the lands and work for Mephibosheth. But Ziba was not a trustworthy person. When Absalom, David's son, tried to take the throne and David had to flee Jerusalem, Ziba revealed his true intentions. He brought provisions to help David during that difficult moment, but took the opportunity to benefit himself. Ziba lied, claiming that Mephibosheth had stayed in the city because he wanted to reclaim the throne of Saul's family. This false accusation was Ziba's way of trying to gain the king's trust while harming Mephibosheth. David seems to have believed Ziba's lie, as he gave him everything that had previously belonged to Mephibosheth, including the lands and wealth that David had restored when he brought him out of Lodebar. At that time, an accusation of treason was very serious and could easily lead to someone's death. Later, when David returned to Jerusalem after Absalom's death, Mephibosheth went to meet the king to defend himself and explain the truth. David asked why he had not come to him earlier, and Mephibosheth revealed what had really happened. He explained that he had asked Ziba to prepare a donkey because, being lame, he could not travel on his own. However, Ziba abandoned him and took the opportunity to lie, falsely accusing him of treason. Furthermore, while David was fleeing from Absalom, the Bible says that Mephibosheth clearly demonstrated his sorrow and loyalty to the king. He did not wash his feet, change his clothes, or trim his beard, actions that, in the culture of that time, symbolized mourning and respect. Through this gesture, it became evident that he did not support Absalom's rebellion. When David finally heard Mephibosheth's version of events, it seems he believed his story and recognized his loyalty. However, David decided that the possessions belonging to Mephibosheth would be divided between him and Ziba. This means that Mephibosheth did not recover everything that was rightfully his. The Bible does not clearly explain why David made this decision. Some scholars suggest that he might have been emotionally shaken by recent events and therefore chose to avoid a direct confrontation with Ziba to demand explanations for his betrayal. Others suggest that David may have been unsure about who was truly telling the truth. In any case, he opted for a middle ground solution, trying to resolve the situation in a neutral way. The most surprising aspect was Mephibosheth's reaction. He gave up his entire inheritance and allowed Ziba to keep everything. For Mephibosheth, the most important thing was not wealth, but David's well-being and the fact that the king had returned safely. This attitude revealed Mephibosheth's character and where his heart truly lay. At that moment, Mephibosheth's words to the king clearly showed the kind of person he was. He said, "Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has returned home safely." This response reveals his humility, loyalty, and a heart unattached to material possessions, something rare and admirable. Although Mephibosheth's story is mentioned in many sermons, it is not always told in its entirety. Often, the focus is solely on the part where he, a lame and despised man, is brought out of obscurity and given a royal inheritance. It is common to talk about how he was placed in a position of honor at Israel's court, sitting at the king's table. After all, that part is inspiring and easy to highlight. It is not always easy to discuss the more challenging side of Mephibosheth's story. He was a lame man who, despite being innocent, was betrayed by his own servant and ended up having to share his inheritance with the one who deceived him. It is difficult to emphasize the example of someone who managed to remain faithful even when he was wronged, harmed, and it seemed like everything in his life was going wrong. It is even harder to talk about his attitude of giving up all his material possessions without holding on to anything, even knowing that his betrayer would keep everything. This selflessness is rare and challenging to understand, but it shows the profound character and humility of Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth's story teaches us profound lessons that go beyond the idea of prosperity or material rewards. At the heart of this narrative is the character of a man who, even in the face of losses, betrayals, and hardships, remained faithful and upheld his principles. Mephibosheth shows us that the true value of a person does not lie in the circumstances they face, but in how they choose to deal with them. For Mephibosheth, what truly mattered was not the possessions he had received or lost, but the fact that God's chosen king David was back in his rightful place. He saw something greater, God's purpose being fulfilled in Israel. His words, as he gave up his entire inheritance, reflect a heart detached from earthly things, focused on what was eternal and truly important. Mephibosheth understood that his true honor did not come from sitting at the royal table, but from seeing the Lord's anointed on the throne, leading God's people. To him, it made no sense to enjoy privileges while David faced difficulties or was in danger. His communion with the king was more valuable than any possession or status. This attitude of Mephibosheth goes beyond a simple demonstration of humility. It reveals unshakable faith and a profound understanding of God's sovereign plan. Despite his physical limitations, the betrayal he suffered, and the losses he endured, Mephibosheth kept his heart focused on something greater than himself. He understood that his life, no matter how challenging, was part of a divine purpose that surpassed his personal pain and frustrations. Mephibosheth did not allow circumstances to define his identity or worth. He knew that true greatness did not lie in wealth, status, or even the justice he might receive in this world, but in aligning his life with God's will. His decision to give up everything he had, without complaint or seeking compensation, reflects absolute trust that God was in control, even when the situation seemed unfair or hopeless. This example teaches us that true faith is not measured by the absence of problems, but by how we respond to them. Mephibosheth recognized that his place in God's story was more important than any material benefit. He chose to value the restoration of divine order, represented by David's return to the throne, above any personal gain. Mephibosheth's attitude reveals something profound. He knew the character of God. He understood that God is faithful and never abandons those who trust in him, even when circumstances seem desperate. This conviction was not just a theoretical idea, but a living truth that sustained Mephibosheth through the losses, betrayals, and challenges he faced. He was certain that God had a greater purpose, even in the most difficult and seemingly unjust situations. This trust is what allowed Mephibosheth to face his adversities without being consumed by bitterness or discouragement. Despite everything he suffered, from the loss of his family to Ziba's betrayal and the loss of his possessions, he remained steadfast, faithful, and with his heart focused on God. He did not let circumstances shape his faith or define his worth. Instead, he chose to look to the God who controls all things, trusting that, in the right time, his justice and mercy would prevail. Mephibosheth also teaches us that true strength does not lie in our physical abilities, possessions, or the approval of others, but in our trust in the Lord. He lived as someone who understood that God is sovereign over all things, and that even the most challenging situations can be used to fulfill his purposes. This gave him peace and purpose, even while living on the margins of society, facing rejection and being forgotten. The story of Mephibosheth challenges us to change our perspective in the face of adversity. It is common in difficult moments to be consumed by doubts and ask, "Why is this happening to me?" However, Mephibosheth's life teaches us a different approach. Instead of questioning the reason, we should seek the purpose. The question, "For what?" opens space to see the lessons God wants to teach us and the greater plans he is accomplishing even through the most challenging situations. Mephibosheth shows us that trusting God, even when everything seems lost, is what gives us the strength to move forward. He experienced events that could have destroyed his faith: the loss of his family, the fall that left him lame, years of being forgotten in Lodebar, and even the betrayal of a servant he should have trusted. Yet he did not allow these difficulties to define his life. He understood that God not only sustains the universe, but also pays attention to the smallest details in each of his children's lives. This understanding transformed the way Mephibosheth dealt with his circumstances. He did not seek revenge, cling to what he had lost, or remain stuck in the past. His trust was firmly placed in God and his purposes. This reminds us that no matter how chaotic life may seem, God remains in control. His sovereignty assures us that nothing happens by chance, and that even moments of pain can be used for good. Focusing on God instead of the difficulties allows us to see beyond the present. When we look to him, we find strength that does not come from ourselves, but from the certainty that he walks beside us. God never abandons us, and Mephibosheth's story is a powerful reminder that he is always working on our behalf, even when we cannot see it. This trust not only helps us endure life's storms, but also gives us hope that they have a greater purpose in God's perfect plan. Now write in the comments if you already knew Mephibosheth's story. Leave a like, share this video with more people, and subscribe to the channel to follow more content like this. May God bless you.